Gazing at Mrs. Bagg's hollow cheeks, scoriated neck, cavernous eye sockets, Sam began to feel as if his attempts to understand the sufferings of a Promethean demigod had hardly scratched the surface of the sufferings of his own human race. And he seemed to hear his exterior soul whispering in his ears that his tortured God was nothing less than a tortured humanity. As he contemplated the damp stones, so sooty and greasy and stained with nameless stains, above the woman's head, and as he looked at the bread upon the table, the two fundamental concepts, bread and stone, seemed to associate themselves with the concept suffering, as forming a sort of ultimate trinity of experience towards which he had been conducted. Thankless labor, external hunger, the deadening throb of a pain that refused to cease. If these things lived on in this room under the Evercreech railway bank, why should he have been permitted to eat sweet treacle and to look out of his window from the top of the old malt house? From the hollow eye sockets of this woman, his mind reverted to similar eye sockets, and far worse ones than hers, that were at this very second in other parts of the world, opening and contracting under the pressure of the cruelty of the first cause, capital F, capital C. Why didn't suffering carried to a certain point, why didn't pain carried to a certain point, simply kill their victims? And since they didn't, to what point must a person go in sympathy for these things who had, by pure accident, been spared their worst scrapings and scoopings? As he went on mumbling about what the Glastonbury Council would soon be doing for its poor, Sam's undermind came to the conclusion that the most serious question of all questions was at what point, if life was to go on with any degree of endurance, is it necessary to harden our hearts and cease to think of the pain of others? Mathematicians talked of invisible points, of formal points. They were the pivots of all the vast spirals of reality. Here, in this question, how far must we share suffering? Had he touched the point of points round which all sensitized consciousness revolved? The vital common sense in Sam stirred up a interior honesty that told him he must draw back somewhere where the natural selfishness in him would rise like Enceladus and throw off all restraint. Did St. Francis stop in the midst of composing his hymn to the sun to ponder on the problem of how far he ought, in place of giving himself up to such magical ecstasy, to visualize the fate of the tortured in the neighboring stone tower, and to ponder on what man at that point of time was doing to man in Algiers, in London, in Seville, in Trebizond, in Paris, and even in Assisi? Sam's sluggish nature had been receiving so many jolts of late that he had been reducing his physical nourishment to so meager a point of late that his nerves were much more sensitized these days than was usually with him. That is perhaps why he stared so fixedly on that bug on the wall. Every locality, he thought, has its own midges, its own gnats, its own beetles, its own lice, its own bugs. They may resemble the others of their tribe, but they must be affected, few will dispute this, by the particular climatic conditions which exist around them. This bug was a Glastonbury bug. Had it any message for him, a Glastonbury man? Can't you throw light on this? He thought, addressing the bug on the wall. But the bug was so extreme an individualist that it regarded the gibberish which reached it from this man's brain as the same sort of telepathic nonsense that it was accustomed to hear when in its heart Mrs. Bagg cried out, "How long, O Lordy, how long, how long?" and it proceeded upon its tortuous way with less curiosity, not to speak of sympathy, than even ex-Mayor Wallop would have felt. Sam, however, while he exchanged a few words now with his friend Jimmy, who continued to stand at the foot of his father's bed, Mr. Bagg himself seemed to be awaiting events in gloomy taciturnity, wrestled stubbornly to the depths of his mind with this problem. A limit there must be, thought Sam, to the sympathy one soul can give to other souls, or all would perish. Absolute sympathy with suffering would mean death. If Christ had sympathized to the limit with the pain of the world, it would have been hard for him to have lived until the day of his crucifixion. But what does that mean? Does it mean drawing back from the hell we stare at? Does it mean that every soul has a right to forget, if it can forget? Sympathy with pain kills happiness. There comes a point where to live at all we must forget. His conclusion left him with a feeling of unutterable weakness, cowardice, contemptibleness. Submerged in his sickening humility, he groaned aloud. He had taken the precaution before starting, in anticipation of the penury of his friend's domicile, to put in his pocket several thick slices of bread and treacle, and these, wrapped up in paper, he now took out and handed to his hostess. It was then that the truth of Jimmy's words about his parents became most painfully apparent. For his mother, after swallowing 2 or 3 hasty bites of one of these sandwiches, presented the rest of them just as they were to the silent man in the bed, who, when once they were in his hands, neither spoke nor looked up until there was not one crumb left upon the sticky paper in which they had been wrapped. He was not at all an ill-looking man either, Sam thought, as those sallow jaws masticated the food and his Adam's apple rose and fell as he swallowed it. But there was something repulsive to that mind, and even a vague sense of something tragic and ghastly. In the way the sunken black eyes of Mrs. Bagg followed every morsel as it disappeared. "Town council do see us don't starve," said the woman presently, "but they gives us no food, only money. And Mr. Bagg feels money be too precious to be throwed away on victuals, so he puts it where it be safe." Mr. Bagg's puffy white face, not an unhandsome face, rising out of his filthy open shirt, lit up complacently on hearing this, and his expression struck Sam as being the meanest human expression he had ever seen. "Too precious to be thrown away," he repeated with unctuous satisfaction, "on victuals, so as put it where it be safe." Sam was still wondering at the back of his mind what could be done to a bedridden miser who was starving his wife, when Mrs. Bagg, who looked positively transparent from lack of nutrition, though she was a large-framed, bony woman, lifted up her voice from where she sat on the stool by the fire, with her discolored skirts hanging so loosely between her gaunt knees that it looked as though they had been thrown across the handles of a plough, and remarked to Jimmy, "Did you arst your friend, the sweet lovely gentleman, whether he could bless this house with half of a silver shilling?" The wheedling gypsy-like tone of her voice, which yet was not the voice of a real gypsy, grated unpleasantly upon Sam's ears. He felt inclined to cry out, "I'll give you a whole shilling if you'll turn it into food and let me see you eat it." He mentally decided that he would come here on the following day with some pork pies that he had seen in the window of a little shop in Manor House Lane, and give one of each member of the Bagg family, and insist upon their eating them before his face. But the voice of the master of the house became audible now. Mr. Bagg was apparently addressing the smoke-darkened, greasy ceiling. When I overhears folk mention shillingses, I says to myself, put on where you be safe. Too precious be thy shillingness to be squandered on wittles. Sam rose to his feet. I've got no money on me, he said, and then, after a pause, well, I'll say good night now, and go down to the river for a bit to get a breath of air. I always sleep better after a breath of air. Don't get up, Mrs. Bagg. Jimmy followed him wistfully with his eyes as he moved to the door. The imbecile's face had a certain blank handsomeness, like the puffy good looks of the man under the blanket, but his expression was submissive and docile, like his mother's. Sam was alarmed lest his own conscience, that merciless and authoritative voice that nowadays always stood by his side, would insist on the allowing Jimmy to accompany him. It was therefore with a certain relief, for which he blamed himself as soon as he was out of the house, that he heard Mrs. Bagg say, "Y'all get some wood for ye, Jim. Why don't ye, before ye do go to Pilgrims's to ask for coppers? Jim be a good lad, mister." The woman called after Sam as he went out. "If it weren't for Jim, Mr. Bagg and me would be separated from each other and put in thick Will's wickus." If you're not separated from Mr. Bagg, thought Sam, you'll certainly get into the Wells Road cemetery. But, standing in the doorway, he threw back a warm and enthusiastic commendation of Jimmy. "I know he was a good son," he said, as soon as he began talking about you both. "Well, I hope he'll have a good luck tonight at the Pilgrimses." "Not for to squander," shouted the handsome, puffy-faced man from his bed, "but for being kept where it be safe." And as he went off, Sam couldn't help giving vent to a wicked wish that Nephew Codfin would discover this safe hiding place. It was nearly dark when, having threaded his way past many scattered hovels and desolate outhouses, he finally reached the bank of the Brew. He was in an excited frame of mind, to which his anger at the behavior of the man in the bed contributed not a little. As he stood staring at the dark flow of the water, you could see that Adam's apple moving up and down as Mr. Bagg swallowed. But Sam nodded his head like one making a resolution that must wait its fulfillment, and began following the bank of the river in its southerly direction. He was now about midway between the wooden Northload Bridge and the stone Pumparlus Bridge, and in the obscurity of the twilight he could see rising out of the mud the scaffolding of Philip Crow's unfinished iron bridge. As has been hinted, for several weeks, Sam had begun to notice with a puzzled wonder that certain unpromising and unlikely objects gave him, as he glanced casually at them, thrilling spasms of a quivering happiness. It was only as these sudden seizures of shocks of uncountable ecstasy increased upon him that he came to give them any particular attention. He was not of an analytic turn of mind, nor was he in any sense what is called psychic. It might even be maintained that Sam's temperament was rather below than above the normal level of what the world had agreed to name spiritual. Mystical he certainly was not. There was more mysticism in John Crow's little finger, for all his skeptical perversity, than in Sam's whole body. But he would have been worse than unimaginative. He would have been duller than the fat weeds on Let's Wharf, not to have noted these reoccurrences of uncountable transport, in which his whole being seemed caught up and transfigured. What made this phenomenon harder to understand was the fact that the objects that served to invoke this ecstasy were so varied and in themselves so insignificant. Not any of them was important enough to afford any satisfactory clue to the nature of the meaning of these thrilling sensations. It was almost as if some mysterious center of magnetic force had been actually moving for some while through the thick darkness of the chemical constitution of that Glastonbury mud and those Glastonbury stones towards Sam's sluggish receptivity. seeking in their receptivity a preordained objective. And what that preordained objective is, we'll have to wait till next time. Goodbye.